I'd like to begin with an outline of how the Clean Air Act addresses ambient air pollutants, known as the criteria pollutants. This is just a high-level overview. We'll get into specifics in the next module. Right up on top of the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, I'm going to call these NAAQS. These are uniform standards that are established by EPA, and they set limits on 6 pollutants. Standards apply nationwide and apply to ambient air levels. Every state has to comply with these standards, and they reflect health-based criteria. Thus, they're called criteria pollutants. The State Implementation Plan, or SIP, is a document states must provide to EPA that demonstrates in detail how the state intends to meet the NAAQS. EPA sets the standard, and then the states decide how it will meet that standard. This is where the flexibility in the Clean Air Act far exceeds that in the Clean Water Act. The states may then subdivide into 2 source area categories. First, some areas of a state may come under the non-attainment program, meaning those areas do not meet one or more of the NAAQS. Second, there will very likely be areas in attainment, meaning those areas meet one or more of the NAAQS. If a state has a non-attainment area, it will then further subdivide its emitting sources into existing stationary sources and new or modified stationary sources. This is a critical distinction because the law imposes different emission standards for existing and new or modified sources. For existing stationary sources, meaning the source was in existence at the time the law takes effect, the state issues operating permits to these facilities, which imposes upon them a technology standard known as Reasonably Available Control Technology, or RACT. This is a technology that achieves a certain level of emission reductions. For new stationary sources, that is, new sources that are built after the law takes effect, or existing sources that make significant modifications and are thus considered new like, the New Source Review Program applies, or NSR. The state administers NSR as a pre-construction permit program, so it applies before the new facility is built or before major changes are made, and it imposes upon them a technology standard known as Lowest Achievable Emission Rate, or LAER. LAER is designed to reduce more pollutants than RACT. The New Source Performance Standards Program, or NSPS, is another program that applies to new or modified sources. NSPS requires reducing emissions by a specific numerical emission limit, and the limits are written by EPA. NSPS applies to about 50 specific industry emitters, such as cement kilns or coal power plants. NSPS serves as a backstop to the existing and new source review programs. This means that as the state writes permits for existing and NSR sources, if any of those sources also happens to have an EPA-developed NSPS emission limit, then the state must not impose a limit that is any less stringent than the NSPS limit. Let's move on to the attainment side, which is easier to understand. The main program that applies here is the Prevention of Significant Deterioration Program, or PSD. This only applies to new or modified sources. Existing sources don't have to implement any controls. They get a free pass. PSD applies its own version of NSR. The main difference between the NSR program here and PSD is that it kicks in at a higher emission level, and it imposes a technology standard known as Best Available Control Technology, which is less strict than LAER. NSPS applies here just as it does on the non-attainment side. This is a lot to take in. In Module 5C, we're going to explain each of the key programs in greater detail. But I want you to pay particular attention to this structure as it applies to stationary sources, which is going to be a major part of understanding the Clean Air Act.